This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Sorry about that. I literally had to fly in from outer space.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
The story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, there's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, I'm here to talk, as the title suggests, of the stories of film. And I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, behind the scenes, bits and bobs, casting, marketing, all the bits and bobs that go to make the films that we know and love. Know and sometimes love, just that really, the films that we know and sometimes love. The movies I tend to cover in this podcast have something of a mainstream leaning to them. They tend to be films I'm invested in or interested in to some degree. The two films I picked for this particular episode, one I like a bit more than the other, but that doesn't mean I punch down on either of them. I think it's a miracle and a half sometimes just to get a film to the screen, and this podcast really is a celebration of that. Without further ado, I'm going to play you a clip from the first of the two films I'm going to talk about in this podcast, and boy is this one of my favourites. Let's go to 1995, and I'll hand you over to Delroy Lindo and Tim Curry.
Well, stop eating my sesame cake. Stop eating my sesame cake! Mm-hmm. What are you doing in my country? You bag of...
Oops. Captain, please. I only wish to explore and discover.
This fellow is a big bag of...
Yeah, I think that's about enough from Delroy there. That was a clip from 1995's Congo, directed by Frank Marshall, screenplay credited to John Patrick Shanley, based on the novel by Michael Crichton. The cast for this one, Laura Linney as Dr. Karen Ross, Dylan Walsh as Dr. Peter Elliott, Ernie Hudson in one of his favourite ever roles, Tim Curry, you heard a bit of there, as Herkimer Homolka, Grant Heslov, Delroy Lindo, Joe Don Baker playing some particularly two-dimensional corporate nasty person, and you get some Bruce Campbell for your money here as well, and that's never a bad thing really, is it? It makes sense actually to start this particular story with a tale that Bruce Campbell himself told. It's hidden away on YouTube somewhere, and it's a clip where he's talking to an audience. Basically it's Defend a Movie, and he's talking about Congo, and the discussion really is what leads to a film like that being made. And he put it to the audience just like, imagine you're a studio executive. Do you want to make a film based on the next film based on the book who wrote Jurassic Park? Do you want one of the producers of Indiana Jones directing? Do you want this acclaimed screenwriter involved? Congratulations, you just made Congo. But even though the film came out in 1995 and Michael Crichton was box office and a half in 1995, the story of this one actually goes back to the 1970s. So it's worth noting that Crichton's movie stock was at its peak in 93 off the back of Jurassic Park and Rising Sun coming out in the same year. Jurassic Park did slightly better than Rising Sun, as it happened. Who'd have thought? Disclosure, that wasn't far behind. But back in the 1970s, Crichton's movie form was hardly shabby as well. Now, just before I get into the depths of the story, I should credit a former colleague of mine, Ryan Lambie, who I used to work with at a website called Den of Geek. We were both on. Ryan's on Twitter at Ryan Lambie, and he did an awful lot of digging into the story behind Congo, which I've leaned on here, and I did ask permission, and I do tip my hat to him as one of my favourite writers. And he basically managed to trace the story back to the late 1970s. And at that point, Crichton was riding high off the back of some film success. Westworld, for instance, was a real breakthrough success. A huge breakthrough there in visual effects as well in Westworld. He'd also had the Andromeda Strain, and he began to noodle with the idea of what would become Congo. Now, he would direct a film called The Great Train Robbery in the 1970s as well, the late 1970s, and that would star Sean Connery, and that whetted his appetite to make another film with Connery, and that film was designed to be Congo. Now, Crichton gave an interview to local press in the US around this time. So I'm quoting from a piece I found in the Toledo Star, but I suspect it was syndicated around America. And he said that for the first and only time in his career, that, and this interview was done at the start of the 1980s, he sold the movie rights to this one before he'd written the book. And it's something that he would regret, that he sold the rights to Frank Yablans at 20th Century Fox. Fox snapped the project up, and at that stage Crichton was describing the story as a modern day take on King Solomon's mines, and that story also threading in the science that was part and parcel of lots of his books. He loved the idea of weaving in research that had been done on sign language for primates into this particular story, and in fact in 1976 he'd taken a research trip to Africa, although he'd never made it to Zaire, the country where he decided to set Congo due to an injury he picked up on that research trip. But he countered that in the end by figuring it gave him a little bit of a clean slate. He was drawn to Zaire in the first place by the fact that it's the only country that brings together gorillas and volcanoes, and that is perfect movie Venn diagram, chums, as I'm sure you'll agree. It was just what Crichton was looking for. But also he was aware too, when he was putting all this together, it was unlikely, because he was thinking of this as a film he'd want to direct himself, that he'd be able to shoot the movie in Zaire, that it's a tricky place to film in, and ultimately the movie didn't shoot in Zaire, and that was 15 years later on. Nonetheless, he set about, in this case, writing the novel first, and by 1980, as he was directing the film Looker, the novel hit the bestseller charts and gave him a success. Now, he'd sold the rights to Congo to Fox in '79 for the sum of $1.5 million, and by selling the rights, it did panic him a bit. Crichton was never an author who was known for writer's block, but in this particular case, he'd put himself under an enormous amount of pressure, and he did admit he struggled to write the book. But in 1980, the book was out, the book was a hit, he was planning to press ahead with it as his next movie project, and the idea then was to shoot it in 1981 with Crichton in the director's chair. So he put together the screenplay for the film, and Fox was still interested. It was full steam ahead. However, here's the condition that kind of broke it a little bit, that Crichton was adamant he wanted a real gorilla to play the crucial role of Amy in the film. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the majesty of Congo, this is a film basically that involves a gorilla hooked up to equipment that allows it to talk. The gorilla is called Amy in the resultant film. Amy is smoking cigars, knocking back a cocktail and jabbering away. But that wasn't quite the version that Crichton was planning to put together. He wanted this real. And Fox was the studio giving us Planet of the Apes, remember? So maybe he thought that there was something in there that they could do. But of course, Planet of the Apes was done by people in costumes. Fox was getting jittery. Nonetheless, pre-production began on whatever 1981's Congo would have looked like, and the search for a gorilla was going on at the same time. But ultimately, and perhaps unsurprisingly, they drew a blank. Even though the film was crewing up at this stage and people were being hired to make it, Crichton wasn't happy. He didn't have his gorilla. He went to Fox and suggested pulling the plug on the film. He was no longer going to direct this movie. But for 20th Century Fox, it had paid $1.5 million for this, and it wanted its gorilla. So it then went to Steven Spielberg and offered the project to him instead. It had paid the bill, and it would take a little while before Spielberg declined. This was post-Jaws and just pre-E.T., but Spielberg had a conversation with Crichton and decided that no, this wasn't to be. But there was the first time that Spielberg and Crichton came into each other's spheres that I know of, and so perhaps the path to Jurassic Park started to be paved at that point. By 1983, Crichton, though, had moved on. He'd moved on to do a film called Runaway, and he said at this point that Congo would never be made. The project nonetheless had a brief resurgence because it was still owned by 20th Century Fox and it's still exploring making it. And so in the later 1980s, again with Sean Connery involved, there were murmurings that the film was going to be made, but again it came to nothing. So then we move on to 1992, and this was 6 months before Jurassic Park came out in America, but the rumblings around Jurassic Park, and it's easy to forget in hindsight, with the benefit of hindsight, just what a risk Jurassic Park was going into the summer without movie star Spielberg off the back of two films that had underperformed by his standards, Always and Hook. So Jurassic Park for a while was not considered, the film that was going to become the flat out hit that it did become. Nonetheless, by the end of 1992, the word of mouth on it was starting to build, and Kathleen Kennedy and Frank Marshall, the wife and husband team, but also regular collaborators and producers with Spielberg, well, they approached Fox to buy the rights off the studio. Marshall had by this point made his directorial debut with the successful Alive. He was looking for another project, and Congo was looking like it was going to be it. When Kennedy and Marshall bought the rights, Paramount then signed the project up, and finally Congo was going to happen. Now, crucially though, while Paramount got involved in Congo, Michael Crichton didn't. That whilst there was some initial promotion that gave him co-screenplay credit, by the end his name was just down to based on the novel by, and the film was heavily sold off the back of from the writer of Jurassic Park. Nonetheless, Crichton's involvement in Frank Marshall's take on Congo was pretty much non-existent from what I could work out. In fact, as Kathleen Kennedy pointed out in a promotional interview around the time of the film's release, Michael sold the rights to the book outright years ago. He's not involved in the movie. It's been floating about in Hollywood since it was published in the 1980s. Lots of people wanted to make it but couldn't figure out how to do it. Well, then there was the job of figuring out how to do it. There's a reason people had struggled with this one. So step forward then, the screenwriter of the ultimate screenwriter of the film, John Patrick Shanley. He'd had success on stage. In fact, he'd written a play that Laura Linney had starred in. He'd won Oscar Gold for Moonstruck as well, and he was interested in adapting the book for the screen. And again, he had no involvement at all with Michael Crichton, but what drew him in part to the project, apart from its stature and its size and the people involved with it, was in the late 1970s he'd done lots of research for a play that he'd written called Gorilla, and he got really quite interested in the subject matter. That came in quite handy, that when he was researching Gorilla, he didn't do the expensive trips that Crichton did to Africa, but he did spend many months in libraries researching primates, and he was primed to bring this this knowledge to the jungle of the lost city of Zinj, just golden. Shanley also expanded on the book. He gave the character of Amy more to do, and he got the screenplay to a point where this project was going ahead. Laura Linney, then, I just mentioned her before, we were at the casting stage. She was highly regarded on Broadway, and she'd been auditioning for a few movies. She'd had small roles in a couple. She'd landed her biggest role in 1994's A Simple Twist of Fate, starring Steve Martin. Bigger things were expected at that in the box office than ultimately transpired, and as a consequence, Congo was going to be her biggest role to that point. As she told Starlog magazine, she went in an audition for it, but also she'd auditioned for the role of Ellie Sattler in Jurassic Park, the role that went to Laura Dern, so she kind of figured she may have been on Kathleen Kennedy and Frank Marshall's radar after that anyway, obviously due to their links with Spielberg and that particular project. By the end of the film, she would be telling Starlog, "I've hung from a tree, I've run from lava, I'm firing guns, and I'm talking to gorillas." She was also particularly thrilled that she got to fire a laser. But Laura Linney was signed up for one of the lead roles in the film. Dylan Walsh came in and took on the other. But the role that Sean Connery was going to play in the film, well, it was a surprise in the end, perhaps, that Connery would not take on the role of Captain Monroe Kelly, a role that had been pretty much the catalyst of the project and certainly Crichton writing it in the first place. Instead, stepped forward Ernie Hudson. And Hudson, by this stage, was known for his work in Ghostbusters, for The Hand That Rocks the Cradle as well. He's also known for appearing in films and not getting on the poster, not even getting his name on the poster. And that would be the case again with Congo, but he would sign up to take on the role and would, as I've just mentioned before, describe it as one of his favourite roles of all time. One of the people who auditioned for the role of Peter Elliot that Dylan Walsh ultimately got, well, that was Bruce Campbell, and instead he took on, he didn't get it, you'll be surprised here, and instead he took on the smaller role of Charles Travis in the movie. He's there fairly early on. There's also a rumour which I couldn't fully back up, I'll just mention it just as tittle-tattle really, that Hugh Grant was offered one of the leading roles in the film but turned it down. The name of Robin Wright was mentioned as well. As for Tim Curry, well, I mean, the scene stealing Tim Curry, who is on the hunt for the lost city of Zinj in the film, he saw his character in a kind of Peter Lorre kind of role, and he signed up to take the role on. He'd just done The Shadow as well. He's having a ball doing films like this in the 1990s, and I would suggest that we, the audience, were the key beneficiaries of that as well. The other part of the casting jigsaw, though, was Amy, the gorilla, played on screen by a couple of people in the end. Misty Rosas was one of them, Lorene No was another. She would ultimately be the work of Stan Winston and the Stan Winston studio. That Winston really wanted this job, that his studio and he were working on the film Interview with the Vampire when it was pitching for it, and when it learned it got the job. Winston at this point landed 2 1995 summer films. Tank Girl was one, Congo was the other, and Congo was by far the biggest of those projects. And if you go on to the Stan Winston School website, there's a lovely description of basically the work that they did on Congo, and it describes on that site how at this point Rick Baker, who'd done The Legend of Tarzan, Lord of the Apes and Gorillas in the Mist, was Hollywood's go-to person for creating realistic apes. And Stan Winston at this point, the late Stan Winston, was known for his robots. Rick Baker was the ape man, as the website describes, and Winston had a competitive nature to him, and he wanted to try doing a gorilla, and he's quoted as saying, Congo was kind of a proving ground for me, or at least that's what I had wanted it to be. I wanted to show the world we could do gorillas too and do them well. And so the task facing Winston and his team was not just creating Amy the gorilla, but also the grey gorillas we see in the movie, gorillas that were given very detailed differences between them that barely showed up in the final film. And so what Winston described, he said, rather than recreate the features of a mountain gorilla, the studio had instructions to design Amy so that she would more closely resemble the cuter lowland gorilla. And he admits, we took a lot of artistic license in the creation of Amy, and he says we shouldn't have taken it in hindsight, but part of that license was taking a lowland gorilla's face and putting it on the body of what was supposed to be a mountain gorilla. And as Winston said, she was cuter, but we paid a price for it because there was a sense of reality that was lost in the character. Do you know, he might have been onto something there. But at this point, they pressed ahead with what they were doing. They built the suit. They built the mechanical heads. They used Lorene No. She was hired first to be the Amy performer, and they sculpted Amy over her, basically. They used silicone rather than foam latex, so they were trying to be at the cutting edge of what they could do in terms of creature creation. They found at first it was too oily. They had trouble painting it, but ultimately they worked their way around that. But as the website says, perhaps the most innovative and advanced aspect of Amy was the mechanical head that could perform virtually all of the character's facial functions. They then built a second head as well when another actor, Peter Elliot, who was the ape behaviourist, came in, and the second head would fit him, and so he would then perform some of the more demanding stuff that was required of Amy. So you're seeing 2 or 3 people as Amy in the film, and you're also seeing a slightly different head at one point as well, if you really want to go back to the film in such forensic detail. I highly recommend you do, in truth. It took about 6 months of rehearsal with the actors for the character of Amy to be realised. And then filming took place between September 1994 and February 1995. It was a big blockbuster movie shoot as well. I mean, this one went across the planet. That the filming took place in Costa Rica, in Kenya, in Tanzania, in Uganda. It didn't go to Zaire, but there was an awful lot of location work involved. The film also was working to a June 1995 release date, and it's worth noting that this was it had its release pretty much to itself. That Congo was being regarded in the build-up to its release as the blockbuster to avoid by the other studios. This was going to be one of the biggest films of the summer. In fact, in an article at the Virginian Pilot reported that Congo was the film that the other studios were moving away from. And this was in a year where there was a Batman sequel, where Disney's Pocahontas, of which huge things were expected, were also being lined up. And it was quite a packed summer schedule. At this stage, summer blockbusters were becoming greater in number, and yet Congo was the film in that schedule in the summer of 1995 that got a weekend all to itself. Paramount spent heavily to push this one as well. Its marketing campaign was said to have gone to 8 figures alone. The film, the negative of the movie was about 50 million just to make the movie in the first place. And then on top of that, the distribution costs were not going to be on the shy side either. But then the studio also figured it had the movie of the summer that brands would want to get involved with. And do you know what? Paramount was right. All sorts of tie-ins would apparently bring in around $80 to $90 million into the studio. They paid for the film. There was Amy the Gorilla staring out for Pepsi Cola cans. There was a deal done with Taco Bell. All this in a film with no stars. But conversely, 2 years earlier, the last big Michael Crichton film with no stars, Jurassic Park, well, that had been the merchandising bonanza of that year, and there was a feeling that Congo was going to be the same. Now, over at Paramount Pictures, studio boss Sherry Lansing, she was supremely confident about this one as well, as this is described in Stephen Galloway's book that I've cited a few times in this podcast. It's really good. It's called Leading Lady Sherry Lansing and the Making of a Hollywood Groundbreaker, and it says in there, Lansing had always been high on the movie, adapted from a Michael Crichton novel about the search for diamonds in Zaire, and she bragged about it during a board meeting with Viacom investors and the Viacom board, to the point where, and apparently this is true, she hired, in the middle of this meeting, an actor was hired in an ape costume to bash the door open, as someone online put it, in the style of the Ed 209 in RoboCop or something like that. And basically smacking the door open, and there's the board of Viacom, and they see someone in a bloody gorilla suit stood at the door. But actually, it's the star of Paramount's blockbuster of the summer. The description in the book says it caused the board members to scatter in fear before they realised the ape was a fake. The confidence then was going high right up to the first test screening of the film. You can guess where this story is going, can't you? Again, the book describes how the first test screening was, quote, a disaster. And this was Paramount at its most confident. Forrest Gump had just won Best Picture, and that had been a project that Lansing had cut the costs on, but championed and fought to get through the system. Lansing actually didn't go to the first test screening of Congo. Instead, she asked her colleague to fax the audience response numbers through to her. However, that fax never came, and the following morning, when still the fax hadn't come through, she gave her colleague a ring and said, what's happened? And he said, I didn't want to wake you. Quote, it was one of the worst screenings we've ever had. It was so bad I decided not to do the cards because half the audience was laughing and the other half walked out. And the cards are the audience response cards, where the audience is questioned after a test screening and you get an approval score basically of the movie and also some more detailed feedback of it. Congo was in deep trouble. and Lansing was fearful that news of the screening would in turn leak out to the Hollywood trade press. And there was a problem with that as well, because if the news had broken in advance of the film's release that Congo was not the cast iron blockbuster juggernaut that it was looking like from the outside, then another studio might choose to chance its arm and move its film to compete against the movie, and all of a sudden that June the 9th release date in the US would not be pretty much exclusive to the film. Lansing needed this to be kept quiet. Now, it's worth noting that, as is the case with lots of test screenings, the effect shots for the film hadn't been finished at this point, but Lansing nonetheless gave Frank Marshall a series of notes, and Frank Marshall on set, I mean, all the interviews say how he was juggling the intensity of the movie and he was coping perfectly well with it, and he was given a bunch of notes by Lansing, and the key note in the midst of it all was the film should be less light and should be darker and scarier. And Marshall agreed with this, and as a consequence, re-editing film got underway on the movie, and a fresh cut of Congo was ultimately put together, and that went in front of a test screening again, and this time the test audience reacted a little more positively to the movie. For Lansing, she also had a little bit of a eureka moment where her son saw the film at one of the early test screenings and liked it, and her son was in his teens at that point. And as a consequence, she'd originally been of the inclination this was a movie that they should be marketing to an adult audience, but then she realised they could probably get away with marketing it to a slightly broader audience off the back of his reaction to the movie, and that's what they did. The marketing thus changed around the film, and I mean, there's not an awful lot of subtlety to the way that the film was promoted. That there's a great big poster for the film that just said that just plays on its Jurassic Park links. Great big picture of a gorilla with some binary and computer programming code. But there it is, where you are the endangered species from the best-selling author of Jurassic Park, Congo. That's all you're getting. You're not getting the name of any star or anything like that. And they pumped the money into selling it and selling it and selling it, and what do you know, for all the backlash that the film got when it was released, it sort of it didn't hit gold, but let's just say it hit bronze. The reviews were not kind to Congo, that there was a lot of pushback against the film. I have to say, I went to see the film when the day it opened in the UK, and I thought it was a flat out hoot. I still think Congo is a hugely entertaining film, warts and all, and I am not blind to its considerable warts. But you've got, I mean, Tim Curry just motoring through the film. No one says the word zinge like him. Delroy Lindo's rant that you heard at the start there, and just the sheer amount of fun of Amy. I just think, as a blast of entertainment, Congo is really far more impressive than it's given credit for. The marketing, though, was what pushed it over the edge, and gave Paramount the hit that it was looking for. So it opened to a box office gross of $24 million, and that was good money at that point. To give you a context of what it was up against, it knocked Casper off the top of the box office chart. The Bridges of Madison County was around. Die Hard with a Vengeance had come a few weeks before, as a Braveheart, as a Crimson Tide. Johnny Mnemonic in the top 10. Remember that Keanu Reeves movie? Bad Boys still hanging around at 14, but Congo had this to itself. It was top of the box office, and by distance. Week 2, its box office dropped heavily, 56%, which is, we expect drops like that to be more dramatic now, less so then. But then Batman Forever was coming along, and Batman Forever opened up with $52 million. Nonetheless, Congo, there was a feeling that, I mean, at this stage, that was Paramount's biggest ever opening weekend. There's a feeling the studio had pretty much got away with this one, that the movie was not without its problems. films, but a worldwide gross of $152 million, $80 million in the US, $70 million overseas. Well, I think Paramount were pretty happy with that in the end, particularly considering that initial test screening. Michael Crichton, unclear whether he particularly ever liked the film. He nonetheless would be juggling other film projects. As for Congo, as for Amy, as for Zinj, I'm all for a cinematic universe of this one, and don't be shy about telling me on Twitter if you are as well. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. If you like this podcast, I am an independent podcast producer. I've only got this far because of the goodwill and kindness of you all. If you could kindly leave me, ideally, a hugely positive review at your podcast repository of choice. Likewise, if you can subscribe to this podcast, then you will play hell with all the algorithms and you will allow us all to conquer the world or something like that. Apparently, that's how it all works. What do I know? I just hugely appreciate the support. Also, at the point this podcast is being released, I'm sending to print a new issue of Film Stories magazine. You can find about that and all the mischief I'm up to at www.filmstories.co.uk. And now I'm going to head on to the second of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode. I'm a bit more up and down on this one, but I just think it's a really offbeat film to get through the studio system. That's why I wanted to talk about it. I'm going to play you a clip from it right now, in fact.
Jerry Fletcher has theories.
The whole Vietnam War was fought over a bet that Howard Hughes lost to Aristotle Onassis.
Some would call his theories crazy.
You're telling me that NASA is going to kill the President of the United States with an earthquake?
Not exactly the kind of thing a Secret Service agent can, just throw himself on top of.
He writes them in his newsletter.
This is the third issue this year. Conspiracy theory.
He sends them out.
Hey, look, I feel kind of naked back here. Could we get out of here?
Please don't tell me you're naked back there.
No, it's just a figure of speech. Could we go?
And she is the only one he trusts.
I've loved you since the first time I ever saw you.
Jerry, you don't love me.
I don't?
Now, one of his theories is true.
Can you prove any of this?
Absolutely not.
Only he doesn't know which one.
Well, that should give you a flavour of 1997's Conspiracy Theory, directed by Richard Donner, written by Brian Helgeland, and starring Mel Gibson, Julia Roberts, and Patrick Stewart. We've just talked about one film that arrived in a very packed summer for summer blockbusters. This one did as well. This one came out in 1997. The summer of 1997 was laden with movie stars, but didn't quite do the business that was expected. The start of the story, though, goes back to screenwriter Brian Helgeland, who would go on to win an Oscar for LA Confidential. But he broke into screenwriting a decade or so before with the film 976 Evil that he wrote with Rhett Topham. That was a film directed by Robert Englund, best known as Freddy Krueger, of course, and Englund it was then who recommended Helgeland as a writer to New Line Cinema, who made the Nightmare on Elm Street films. As a consequence, Helgeland would write the fourth Elm Street movie. He would also go on to do 1992's Highway to Hell, but after that, the work was apparently in shorter supply, and that was something that led him to the gate of Warner Brothers. And this is a tale that Richard Donner tells in a DVD commentary, that Donner discovered Helgeland at the gate of the Warner Brothers lot in Los Angeles, holding a sign basically saying he'd work for money. And Donner stopped and had a conversation with him. Whether this is true or not, I don't know, but it's Donner's story, and who am I to disbelieve? Helgeland explained more, that he was a screenwriter, he'd done these films, he was looking for work, and the pair hit it off. And they hit it off to the point that Helgeland would end up working on Donner's upcoming movie Assassins, which was originally written by the Wachowskis, but would star Sylvester Stallone and Antonio Banderas, and would end up a very different film, and Helgeland in part was responsible for that. But Helgeland also had another idea, and he was new. He did an interview with a site called Go Into the Story, and he always said that his films start with a character, and in particular, he came up with the character of Jerry Fletcher, a cab driver who just came up with conspiracy theories before Facebook was invented. Who knew that he would publish that? I mean. Just as an aside, this film is crying out to be remade in the internet, social media, and bluntly Facebook era. But nonetheless, the idea was a cab driver who wrote down all his conspiracy theories in a newsletter, and then, as you heard in the clip, one of them just suddenly happens. He happens upon something that's actually true. Now, he was developing that idea, whereas separately at the start of the 1990s, Julia Roberts and Mel Gibson, two of the biggest movie stars in the world at that point, well, they were looking to make a Western comedy together. It was going by the name of Renegades, but this was one of the umpteen projects that got stuck and chewed up in the Hollywood system. The scheduling of both stars didn't help, but also it said that quite a lot of things went wrong on this one. Gibson in the end went off to do Lethal Weapon 3 with Richard Donner. Julia Roberts would go off to make Hook, a film she didn't have a great time on, and she took time off in the aftermath of that, and Renegades just fell apart. Gibson, as it would happen, would go off and do a different Western comedy by the name of Maverick, of course, that I'll be coming to in a future episode of Film Stories. By 1994, though, Helgeland and Donner were working on Assassins. And Helgeland took his chance that he had Richard Donner's ear. He was on the set with him, and he told Donner the idea of a film he'd had about conspiracies. And Donner was just like, yeah, there's something in there. Make the base of a good television series. And so Helgeland went off and started writing, and he came up with this base idea. And then work went on with the completion of Assassins, whilst in the background of that, rumours of Lethal Weapon 4 with Donner and Gibson, well, they were rumbling on as well. Helgeland completed his script. It went out into the marketplace, and Donner saw it. And when he saw it, he realised actually that this isn't a TV project at all. There's something a lot more to this. The script started to do the Hollywood rounds, and Mel Gibson saw it as well. And Mel Gibson, at this point, by the time the script was doing the rounds in early 1996, while he was about to win Oscar Gold for Braveheart, which had been a huge hit the year before, he was also shooting Ransom at that point, which I've covered in a previous Film Stories episode. But one of the things on Ransom is he sustained an injury. He had to have an operation in the midst of that film, so pretty much wiping him out a little bit. And so he wasn't ultimately looking to pursue conspiracy theory at that point. But one man who was producer Joel Silver. He latched on to this one, and he really wanted to do the film. And even though Mel Gibson perhaps wasn't interested, he was courting other potential stars. Jim Carrey's name was mentioned, Brad Pitt's name was mentioned, Winona Ryder's name was mentioned. I'm coming back to her very shortly on this. Silver wanted to do the film, but off the back of Braveheart, Gibson didn't. He was an Oscar-winning director now, and he was looking for weightier fare to do. And instead, he was focusing on a planned remake of the book, a movie remake of Fahrenheit 451, adapted from the novel, which was a pet project of his. I believe it may still be a pet project of his. And that, too, as it happened, was a film that would never make it off the page. But by this time, Donner and Silver were united in the fact that they wanted to make conspiracy theory, and they wanted Gibson to star in it. And thus, Gibson at this stage had an office on the Warner Brothers lot. He was one of their key movie stars of the 90s. And Donner and Silver went over to his office without an appointment. And just as Gibson told Entertainment Weekly magazine, which I've got in front of me here, there's a nice rustle. I can tell you that the issue is 392 from August 1997. But Gibson just said, Joel said he'd contemplated bringing over a set carpenter to nail the door shut until I said yes. The conversation about the movie in this unprompted meeting went on for about an hour and a half, and in the end Gibson did say yes, but straight away that presented a problem for the film. First of all, it was clearly going to happen if it got Richard Donner and Mel Gibson involved in it. The script was in place, but Gibson was now going to cost the town's new price for a movie star, which was $20 million. That Jim Carrey's casting in The Cable Guy had changed the Hollywood star ceiling, and now if you wanted a top movie star in your film, whereas just a couple of years before you were paying $15 million, now it was $20 million plus a slice of things. Richard Donner as well, he's not a cheap director, and you know, he's earned that. The commercial returns of his films speak for themselves, so he was going to cost $25 million, and so straight away, before a frame of footage had been shot or Helgeland's script had been bought up, it's $25 million just for two key people, two key parts of personnel for the movie. But then it also needed a female co-star to take on the role of Alice Sutton alongside Mel Gibson's Jerry Fletcher. Jodie Foster was one person who was considered at this point, but she was committed to making contact elsewhere for Warner Brothers, so she couldn't take the job on. And Foster had worked very successfully with Gibson in the aforementioned Maverick. But then the idea of Julia Roberts came up. Now, Roberts wasn't the commercial gold at this particular point that she'd been back in 1991. She was about to become commercial gold again, but that wasn't anything really you could say in other than hindsight, save for the fact that she'd chosen a particularly juicy project to do next. So that juicy project was My Best Friend's Wedding. She was in Chicago making My Best Friend's Wedding when the script for Conspiracy Theory was sent to her. And she still wanted to work with Gibson. She read it. She said she was interested. But the problem there was the studio, Warner Bros. Didn't have the cash to have Mel Gibson and Julia Roberts in a slightly offbeat film of this ilk. And so they wanted Roberts to cut her fee, or as they put to Joel Silver, Julia Roberts for a lower price, basically. Silver, though, he was convinced that My Best Friend's Wedding was going to be a huge hit, and it would have been her first big hit in a while. She'd have a succession of them afterwards. But Silver ended up going to Warner Brothers co-boss at the time, Terry Semel, to argue the case. And as Silver told Entertainment Weekly, I'm selling them on a TriStar movie, so they'll put her in ours. TriStar Pictures being the company behind My Best Friend's Wedding. And he worked on Terry Semel and worked on him, and eventually Semel agreed to loosen the purse strings and stump up the cash that would be required, and it would be an 8-figure salary to get Julia Roberts in Conspiracy Theory as well. But the problem was, at this point, the dithering had cost them. That in the time they were mulling whether to cast Roberts herself was less interested. She'd just come off the back of a run of films. She'd done Something to Talk About, then went straight into Mary Riley. She did Michael Collins. She did a cameo in Woody Allen's Everyone Says I Love You, or carry a small role in that. And after My Best Friend's Wedding, she now planned to take a break. She hadn't had a break for a while. She's feeling run down and exhausted. She wanted to go on holiday. However, that didn't work with what Warner Brothers needed, because it had a start date now for Conspiracy Theory and a budget in place. It was looking to spend around $70 million on the movie, and the film needed to go before the cameras in October 1996 to hit a summer 1997 release date, which, given the amount of money Warner Brothers was spending on the film, it would need to be a summer movie or a Christmas one, but this felt more summery. This wasn't, after all, the era where you could release a film in February and expect it to be a blockbuster. That's a relatively modern phenomenon. So to hit a summer release, they had to start filming this one in October 1996, because there was also Mel Gibson and Richard Donner's schedule to work around too. But they didn't have that co-star. The search carried on fruitlessly for a while, but Silver wasn't giving up. He was putting in daily calls to Roberts' agent at the time, Elaine Goldsmith. He was sending champagne to Roberts' assistants, and as Goldsmith told Entertainment Weekly, and appreciating the language probably makes it sound harsher than it actually is, but it does seem to come across in the article in quite a jocular way, just to be clear. Joel harassed me so much, see what I mean, between work and home, that one Sunday night my husband looked at me and said, "Why hasn't Joel called today?" Gibson too, he was trying to woo Roberts for the film, but in the meantime that start date was coming close. They got to the start of September without having someone in place. Robin Wright, she was we just talked about her for Congo. She was offered the role, but she just had a child and was living in Los Angeles and didn't want to be away from her children to shoot on location in New York. Gwyneth Paltrow, meanwhile, she nearly signed on to make the movie as well, but she opted instead to go and make a film that never came to light in the end with her dad, that she was looking to make around that point. Winona Ryder, the offer went out to her, but she couldn't get out of her Alien Resurrection schedule. The two films would overlap too much, and it was thus impossible. So it was back to Julia Roberts, who was never off the list, as you can probably imagine. But 2 weeks before the film's start date, Roberts agreed to meet Richard Donner, Joel Silver and Mel Gibson in New York, and they booked suites at a hotel where they had rooms, and they had a friendly chat. But Silver wasn't going to let her leave without his answer. As Roberts joked again in that Entertainment Weekly article, they promised me the moon and that they'd work around my nap time, and she was gradually being talked into the film. So she decided to leave the suite and go back to her own room to make a call. And when she opened the door to her room, in there she found a brass band, I'm not making this up, that Silver had hired, that struck into music as soon as they saw her. Then she realised that Gibson was stood behind her with a lamp on her head. Roberts creased up and finally gave in. She put the call into Goldsmith and said, "Looks like we're going to do the film." Then there was Patrick Stewart, of course, high off the back of Star Trek The Next Generation at this point, but hadn't fully crossed over into movies. But he was working on a film called Mastermind when he got a call off Silver asking him to play the foe of the movie, Dr. Jonas. Richard Donner held that meeting with Patrick Stewart at his offices. Stewart flew in for it, and they talked about pretty much everything but the film. But they had an hour chat, and Stewart got on particularly well with Donner. But he too was an actor who was looking to take time off at this point. That his plan was, once he'd finished making Mastermind, he would go back to England to, quote, build a stone wall at his house. But a couple of things persuaded him to take conspiracy theory on. One of them was Mel Gibson, one of them was Julia Roberts, and one of them was a cheque for $5 million, which was, by distance, his highest movie payday at that point, at least outside of the world of Star Trek. Star Trek Generations had crossed to the big screen in 1994, of course. Stewart still had commitments that he had to honour. He was committed, for instance, to a stage run of A Christmas Carol in Los Angeles at Christmas 1996, so they needed to work around that. He had other projects that he was committed to as well. He's doing a miniseries of Moby Dick, for instance. So 2 other Stewart projects agreed to move their shoot date so Patrick Stewart could sign up to star in Conspiracy Theory. Finally, at the last minute, basically, the cast and crew had come together for this movie, and the shoot began in New York in October 1996, and it would run through to the following February. And this was a premium Warner Brothers project. It cost this $70 million to bring everything together. But more than that, director of photography John Schwartzman, he got permission off the studio to use a specially processed film to give an effect between colour and black and white that cost twice the usual price. And as a consequence, that was going to add nearly $500,000 just to the distribution costs of the movie. Donner and Gibson were working together for, by this point they'd done 3 Lethal Weapons, they'd done a Maverick, so this was their 5th film together. They had more to follow, and so they had shorthand working with each other. Donner gave Gibson the space to improvise, and Gibson duly did, and the shoot was completed pretty much on time. But one thing that was left behind with it was some indecision over the film's ending, that they couldn't quite work out which of the 2 proposed finales to go with. And so in the end on this one, and this wasn't decided by the time filming finished on February the 7th 1997, Donner had 2 endings in the can, that he'd shot it 2 ways. Whilst the film was going on, incidentally, chatter had sprung up about a possible Lethal Weapon 4. That was stirred in part by Danny Glover coming to visit the set, so that didn't help as well. But it seemed to be that it was Joel Silver in the trade press who was stirring those rumours up. Of course, that was never proven, so don't sue me, Mr. Silver, if you happen to be listening. But of course, Lethal Weapon 4 would ultimately happen. But there was also, with one of those 2 endings, the idea that a Conspiracy Theory 2 might be on the cards. Once the film was complete, the choice of the ending was actually left to a test audience. That they did it that openly. It's just like they went with the one that the test audiences preferred. Now, that would be the ending that Richard Donner himself would describe as, quote, less pure, but also it was the ending, as it happened, that left things open to a sequel, and Warner Brothers, of course, would be interested in that. But there was a problem with post-production as well, in that Richard Donner felt that this should be a PG-13 rated movie, but when the film was submitted to the Motion Picture Association of America, it came back with an R rating instead, and he wasn't happy about it at all. And he actually fought and pushed back on this, and he argued that much harsher films were getting PG-13s, but he was told by the MPAA that it was the tension of the moments between Mel Gibson and Patrick Stewart, and just the sinister edge to it all that tipped it over into an R, and that R rating stuck, and there's a feeling that could have hurt the film's commercial prospects in the end. But that release date was nonetheless coming forward. It was approaching. It was August the 8th was the date that it was going into American cinemas. So slightly later summer release than you'd ordinarily expect for a movie star film. It hadn't been a great summer for big blockbusters, of course. That was the summer of Speed 2. And Warner Brothers had come a bit of a cropper with Batman and Robin as well. It did have Contact around the corner. But the problem it hit with Conspiracy Theory was the response to it wasn't great. The reviews were mixed. I think that's fair to say. But I think it was Roger Ebert who probably put it the best, where he says that it cries out to be a small film. There's an intriguing premise in conspiracy theory, but it kind of gets lost in the cloak of a blockbuster movie, which is kind of how I feel about it too. That I think there's some really interesting stuff in here, and it's amazing something so offbeat managed to get through. That's the power of a movie star for you. But it kind of jumps it's almost like it misses a first act. It just kind of jumps in and is a little bit all over the shop, and the ideas are all a little bit diluted, really. But nonetheless, in spite of those reviews, the movie star power rewarded Warner Brothers' investment, that the film would make $75 million in the US, $61 million overseas. And that wasn't the level that the studio was expecting. But nonetheless, it had a $19 million opening weekend. And that was pretty good business in the scheme of things. It knocked Air Force One off the top of the charts. But Air Force One had opened with nearly double the amount of money a couple of weeks before. Also in the top 10 as Conspiracy Theory came out, Spawn was at number 3, George of the Jungle, the brilliant George of the Jungle, at 4. One of the blockbuster films that really had delivered in 1997, the first Men in Black, was well past $200 million. Contact was out at this point as well and was doing pretty decent business, although not as much as it would deserve, I would argue. And there was a feeling in the end that Conspiracy Theory had just about done enough, but still fallen below what was ultimately expected. No matter though, because Helgeland was off to work with Mel Gibson again on a film called Parker, which would ultimately come out under the name of Payback, and that is a story and a half for a future episode. Donna was also working with Gibson again. They did in the end go off and do Lethal Weapon 4. I've covered that in a previous podcast as well. Julia Roberts, hopefully she got the holiday at that point, but she was about to embark on a run that would include Runaway Bride, Notting Hill, and her Oscar-winning Erin Brockovich, and she was about to hit one of the best, if not the best, point of her career as well. Kind of a film that's just got a little bit lost in the 90s, but I still think it's an interesting anomaly. It's worth seeking out, and it's just one of those films that, for better or worse, they really don't make them like that anymore. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. You can find more of my waffling on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod on Twitter as well. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/Film Stories Online. You can find video exclusive Film Stories at youtube.com/Film Stories. And then also there's our website, www.filmstories.co.uk. If you head there, you get every weekday a dose of the latest movie news and more features to have a good nosy around. There you can also find out about our 2 print magazines, Film Stories and Film Stories Junior, and get the details of the latest issues of both of those, as well as buy back issues and other bits and bobs. But I think that'll do for now, won't it? Thank you as always for your time. Thank you for listening. And the most important thing, each and every week, you all take care of yourselves, stay safe, and I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Bye bye.